In the winter of 1884, a monster stalked the darkness of Austin, Texas. While the city slept, he moved through back alleys and servant quarters, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror that would haunt the community for more than a century. He killed at least 8 times, perhaps more, and then vanished into history. His name was never spoken in court. His face never appeared on wanted posters. But the world would remember him by a name coined by one of America's greatest short story writers, the Servant Girl Annihilator. This is the true story of America's first serial killer, a predator who struck more than 3 years before Jack the Ripper ever walked the streets of London, and whose identity remains one of criminal history's greatest mysteries. The killer, who would become known as the Servant Girl Annihilator, emerged from the shadows of a city transformed by war and emancipation. Austin, Texas, in 1884 was not the capital city we know today. It was a frontier town of roughly 15,000 souls, recovering from the devastation of the Civil War and struggling to define itself in the new era of Reconstruction. The wounds of that conflict were still fresh. The racial divisions that had shaped the South for generations remained etched into every aspect of daily life, and it was within these divisions that a killer found his hunting ground. The Austin of this era was a city of contradictions. Grand state buildings rose alongside freedman communities struggling for survival. The governor's mansions stood just blocks from neighborhoods where former slaves lived in segregated clusters, barred from the economic and social opportunities enjoyed by white residents. Among these marginalized communities were the servant quarters behind the homes of Austin's white elite. These small cabins and back houses occupied by domestic workers who cooked, cleaned and maintained households would become the epicenter of a killing spree unlike anything America had ever seen. In the years that followed the Civil War, conditions for African American women in domestic service were precarious. They worked exhausting hours for meager wages and lived in cramped quarters often attached to their employers' homes. They slept in rooms accessible from outside doors. Their lives were fundamentally insecure, their futures uncertain. Many had fled violence and poverty in rural Texas, seeking refuge and opportunity in the city. They found instead exploitation, discrimination, and for at least 8 women death. The identity of the killer remains officially unknown to this day, but the prime suspect, identified through modern forensic analysis more than a century after the crimes, was a 19-year-old African-American cook named Nathan Elgin. Born in 1866 in Wheatville, Austin's freedman community, Elgin was the son of a father who had remarried, creating a disrupted family structure that would profoundly shape the young man's psychology. Census records from 1880 listed 14-year-old Nathan's occupation as servant, indicating years of domestic work that subjected him to the authority of female employers at an impressionable age. He lived within the tight-knit African-American community of East Austin, working as a cook in a region adjacent to multiple murder sites, and he possessed a physical characteristic that would become crucial to understanding the crimes. Nathan Elgin was missing his right little toe. The first killing came on December 30th, 1884. Mollie Smith, a 25-year-old African-American woman, was found murdered at her residence near West 6th Street and Bowie Street. She had been struck in the head with an axe while she slept, then dragged into her backyard where she was raped and mutilated. Her partner, Walter Spencer, survived the attack with serious wounds, providing one of the few eyewitness accounts of the killer's methods. This was not a crime of passion. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was the beginning of something far more terrible. The pattern was established with terrifying clarity. The killer struck at night, targeting women while they slept in their beds. He used an axe to deliver crushing blows to the head. Then, with methodical precision, he dragged their bodies outside, violating them in death, mutilating their remains. The victims were African-American women, domestic servants living in the marginalized spaces of wealthy white Austin, their deaths barely registered in a society that viewed their lives as expendable. The murders did not stop. In March 1885, the killer attacked 2 Swedish servant girls, Clara Strand and Christine Martenson, seriously wounding both in a single night. This expansion of victim profile revealed a predator growing bolder, more confident. He no longer limited himself to African-American women. May brought new death. On May 6, 1885, Eliza Shelly became the second confirmed fatality. 16 days later, on May 22nd, Irene was murdered. In August, Clara Dick survived a serious wounding. On August 30th, the killer attacked 11-year-old Mary Ramey, along with her mother Rebecca, killing the child while her mother survived. The inclusion of a child marked a terrifying escalation. This was no longer a killer with specific targets. This was a monster indiscriminate in his violence. September 28, 1885 brought the deadliest single night of the killing spree. Orange Washington and Gracie Vance were murdered together. Washington was killed because he was present during the attack. The message was clear: anyone in the killer's path would die. Then came the night that changed everything. December 24th, 1885, Christmas Eve, the killer struck twice in one night, and this time the victims were different. Susan Hancock, described by contemporaries as one of the most refined ladies in Austin, was sleeping in her 16-year-old daughter's bed when she was attacked. Hours later, 17-year-old Eula Phillips was similarly murdered in her own home. Both women were white. Both came from respectable families. Their deaths shattered the illusion that the murders were confined to a world the white elite could ignore. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Where African American victims had prompted little more than routine investigation, the deaths of white women created panic in the corridors of power. Vigilance committees formed overnight. Private detectives were hired. The Austin Police Department was reorganized under pressure to produce results. Over 400 suspects were interrogated. Rewards were offered. The city that had slept through the deaths of black women now trembled at the thought that the killer might come for them. And then, after December 24th, the murders stopped just as suddenly as they had begun. The killings ceased. The city held its breath through January, February, March. No new bodies appeared. The vigilance committees gradually stood down. Austin slowly exhaled, never knowing if the nightmare had truly ended or merely paused. The moniker Servant Girl Annihilator did not originate with police or newspapers. It came instead from the pen of a writer who would later achieve literary immortality. William Sidney Porter, better known as O. Henry, was living in Austin during the murders. Working as a draftsman and journalist, on May 10, 1885, Porter wrote to a friend named Dave Hall. "Town is fearfully dull," he wrote, "except for the frequent raids of the Servant Girl Annihilators, who make things lively in the dull hours of the night." Porter's coinage, published decades later in his anthology Rolling Stones, provided a name that would outlast the crimes, but his phrase reveals as much about the culture that produced these murders as about the killer himself. To reduce murdered women to servant girls, to describe their slaughter as making things lively, was to frame horror as entertainment. No one was ever convicted for these murders. Suspects came and went. Theories were proposed and dismissed. One prominent alternative was Maurice, a Malaysian cook at Pearl House Hotel, who left Austin 3 weeks after Eula Phillips's murder. Husbands were accused based on jealousy. James Phillips was convicted of his wife's murder, only to be later acquitted. Moses Hancock's trial ended in a hung jury. Justice remained elusive. The case might have remained unsolved if not for a breakthrough over a century later. In 2014, the PBS program History Detectives applied modern forensic techniques, identifying Nathan Elgin as the most probable perpetrator. The evidence rests on 4 pillars. First was physical evidence. Sheriff Malcolm Hornsby had deliberately withheld a detail from the press. The killer's footprint showed an unusual characteristic. One footprint contained only 4 toes on the right foot. Elgin was missing his right little toe. The match was precise. After Elgin's death, Sheriff Hornsby made a cast of his foot. It matched perfectly. This provides the strongest direct connection to the murders. Second was geographic proximity. As a cook in East Austin, Elgin knew the neighborhoods. Years of domestic work provided knowledge of household layouts. Third was temporal correlation. The murders stopped after Elgin's death. On February 6, 1886, he attacked a woman in a saloon. When police intervened, he brandished a knife and attacked Officer John Bracken. Bracken fired, mortally wounding Elgin, who died the next day. No further murders occurred. Fourth was behavioural profiling. Elgin showed escalating aggression for years. In 1881, at age 15, he was arrested for carrying a pistol. In 1882, he sent a threatening letter promising to whip, destroy and kill. These were classic serial killer precursors, yet despite this evidence, the case officially remains unsolved. No trial was ever held. The Servant Girl Annihilator occupies a unique place in criminal history. The murders ended in 1885. 3 years later, Jack the Ripper began in London. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Both targeted vulnerable women, both mutilated bodies, both eluded capture, but there were differences. The Annihilator used an axe and dragged victims outdoors. The Ripper used knives in streets. Modern historians view the connection as intriguing but unsupported. For over a century, the case remained a footnote in American history. The racial identity of most victims reduced press coverage. Police files were destroyed. Austin discouraged commemoration. The victims were largely forgotten as individuals. They became statistics. The modern revival began with Skip Hollandsworth's 2000 Texas Monthly article. His 2016 book, The Midnight Assassin, provided the first comprehensive treatment, restoring humanity to the forgotten victims. Oakwood Cemetery in Austin is the final resting place for many of the victims. Today, ghost tours and historical markers commemorate the crimes. In 2016, the Texas Historical Commission erected a state historical marker. The solution lay within reach. The sheriff knew about Elgin's missing toe. He testified to the evidence, but he never brought charges. The victims were deemed unworthy of full justice. Let us speak their names once more. Mollie Smith, Eliza Shelly, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Orange Washington, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, Eula Phillips. They were not throwaway people. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They were human beings with hopes and dreams, lives cut short by evil. Nathan Elgin lived among the community. For over a year, he killed with impunity. Then he died in a shootout, taking full answers with him. The case officially remains unsolved, but the evidence points clearly to one man with 4 toes. The servant girls he annihilated deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told. Their humanity deserves to be recognised. This has been a Secrets Uncovered deep dive. Thank you for listening.